Tonight, we're going to continue with our series on the Canon of Scripture, and we're looking tonight at the Book of Enoch. So, just as a reminder, or for those that haven't been in these classes, when we talk about canon, we're just talking really about the list of books that are inspired by God that actually belong in the Bible. And so we've looked at some of the books written by the Gnostics later on after the whole Bible was complete. We looked last time at the Apocrypha, which were books that were written before the time of Jesus, but after the end of the Old Testament. And some of them, well, actually all of those books, were included in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, but they were not included in the Hebrew Bible, and they were never really considered to be inspired, at least not by the majority of the Jews. Tonight we're going to look at Enoch, which is a little bit different, this book, although it's very similar to those of the Apocrypha. First, I want to make sure we understand who was the real Enoch. He's talked about in Genesis chapter 5, verses 18 through 24. It starts with Adam and goes down, and then in verse 18 it says, Jared lived 162 years and begot Enoch. After he begot Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Enoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. After he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And in Hebrews 11, verse 5, it refers back to him, and it says, By faith Enoch was taken away, so that he did not see death, and was not found, because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. Right? He walked with God 300 years. So Enoch never died, but his time on earth was 365 years. And he was the father of Methuselah, who was the father of Lamech, who was the father of Noah. And the flood, came in the days of Noah. All right, so that's what we know about Enoch. Not a whole lot. So what is this Book of Enoch? So the Book of Enoch was written, or at least the best that anybody can figure out, it was written about the same time as the Apocrypha books, so in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So it was definitely written before Jesus, and almost certainly written after Malachi. Okay, so the difference is that the Book of Enoch, what's different from the Apocrypha books is that this one was never included in the Septuagint or any collection of books of the Bible by the main groups of the Jews. So it claims to be written by Enoch, the seventh from Adam, who never died. He was the great-grandfather of Noah, and it's considered to be interesting reading, but it was never considered inspired by the mainstream Jews. So they're the only ones that we know of who considered it part of the canon or inspired by God were some Jews in Ethiopia. And that's how we have a copy of it today, is because they had it. But that's all I'm aware of as far as the Jews that would have considered it to be inspired. So today people like to talk about it, to get interest, to sell things. That's, get you to watch their videos and read their articles and all that sort of thing. And they'll tell you that, it has some knowledge that others are trying to keep hidden. They just don't want you to know what's written in this book. And we'll talk also a little bit about the fact that Jude seems to quote from this book, which would possibly indicate that it's an inspired book, but we'll get there a little bit later on. But this is thought to have been written between 300 and 100 years before Jesus, based on the manuscripts that could be found. It was thought to be originally written in Hebrew and Aramaic, but they only have found Aramaic. They haven't found any Hebrew. And that's only of the first parts of the book. They actually believe that it was not all written by the same person, but over that span of 200 years or 300 years, somewhere in there, different parts of the book were added on by different people. The first parts of the book are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they're not grouped with the scrolls of Scripture. There's a separate collection of books, not with the books of the Old Testament that they're found in. And the only full copy of the book is in this Ge'ez, I don't know how you pronounce that, this translation for the Ethiopian Jews. So that was found by Europeans in 1773. Somebody actually went looking for it to Ethiopia because they had heard about it, and they brought back 3 copies of it. And eventually that was translated into English. But nobody had had a copy of that book except for the Ethiopians for probably more than 1,000 years. So it's a fairly new thing, unlike the Apocrypha, which have been around because they were part of the Septuagint. Those were around throughout history from the time of their writing, basically, and that's not exactly the case with the Book of Enoch. It disappeared from everybody except the Ethiopians for a very long time. Now, this man, David Chariot, I don't know who he is, but he wrote this foreword to the complete Book of Enoch, the standard English version. And a couple of things he says is that the Book of Enoch, also known as First Enoch, was once cherished by Jews and Christians alike. This book later fell into disfavor with powerful theologians, precisely because of its controversial statements on the nature and deeds of the fallen angels. Well, it's not just controversial, it's contradictory in a lot of what it says, but this is what people will tell you. In another place, he says, despite its unknown origins, Christians once accepted the words of this Book of Enoch as authentic scripture, especially the part about the fallen angels and their prophesied judgment. In fact, many of the key concepts used by Jesus Christ himself seem directly connected to terms and ideas in the Book of Enoch. Thus, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that Jesus had not only studied the book, but also respected it highly enough, to adopt these things, the descriptions, the terms, and so on. And he even seems to think that just the term "the wicked" is out of the Book of Enoch, which gives you an idea of what he means by Jesus used a lot of terminology from the Book of Enoch. It's also terminology from the whole Old Testament, which the Book of Enoch borrows from. But anyway, this is the type of thing that some people will say about the Book of Enoch, and they'll get people all worked up. Oh, so there were powerful theologians who tried to bury this thing because they didn't like what it said. And that's not the case. There were powerful theologians who tried to bury the book of James or different books in the Bible, but they could not do that because they are inspired books and people recognize them as such. That's not the case with the Book of Enoch. When we look at what the Book of Enoch actually says, it talks about the giants that we read about in Genesis chapter 6. It says that they were fathered by angels who sinned by marrying women and then taught them sinful things. In First Enoch chapter 3 and in verses 1 through 4, it talks about these angels getting together and saying, let's go down and marry these women. And in verse 3, it says, and Simjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. And then they all went and married these women and had these children who were giants, taught them to do evil things. Those giants ate people and all that sort of thing. That's according to the Book of Enoch. This is not an uncommon view as far as those giants being children of angels marrying women. That was a view of a lot of the Jews, I think, before this book was written. But it's not really anything you can get that idea by reading the Bible itself. It also talks about the fallen angels being bound until the day of judgment. So in chapter 4 in verse 10, the Lord said to Raphael, who's one of the angels who did not rebel, according to the book, bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudiel, and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face, that he may not see light. And on the day of the great judgment he shall be cast into the fire. Now that sounds a lot like what we read in the New Testament, right? And so there's this argument that the New Testament is basing that on what's written in the Book of Enoch, but just because the Book of Enoch gets some things right, not the details about Raphael and Azazel and there's some place in the desert where these angels are kept. That's not right. But the idea of there being a place where angels are kept until the day of judgment, we know is true. But he goes into these specifics which do not fit reality, because this is a physical place where spiritual beings are being kept, which doesn't really make sense. It also talks about Enoch disappearing, but still being on the earth. And he was going back and forth from the fallen angels to God. So, because the angels, these fallen angels, were on earth, right? So they couldn't talk to God anymore. So he was the one going back and forth. He was sent to rebuke them. And then they asked him to bring a petition for forgiveness to God for them. And God said, no, he will not forgive them. Which, in the New Testament, it tells us that, Jesus does not give help to angels. And so the idea that they are not going to be forgiven is valid. However, this idea of Enoch going back and forth is not something that really makes any sense. It also talks about the giants becoming evil spirits on the earth, or essentially that's where the demons came from, were these giants that came from these angels and the women. And but it says that they would trouble people until the final judgment, which we don't know about these evil spirits in general until the time of Christ, and then they've disappeared, right? There are no demons today doing anything. Well, I can't say there's no demons today, but they're not doing what they did before. But maybe, there's the doctrine of demons, things like that. Maybe what he's talking about would be included in that. But anyway, this idea of that's where the demons came from, or the evil spirits, that's a pretty weird idea. But anyway, that's the idea here. But we don't really know where the demons came from. So that's what his explanation is. In Enoch chapter 6, verses 11 through 13, he makes some observations about the earth that just aren't true. So he says, I saw the winds of heaven turn and bring the circumference of the sun and all the stars to their setting. Now, maybe I misunderstand what he means by that, but it sounds like he views the sky as a solid object that the sun and the stars are attached to, and it turns around. He also says in verse 13, I saw at the end of the earth the firmament of the heaven above, and I proceeded and saw a place which burns day and night, where there are 7 mountains of magnificent stones. And this idea of the end of the earth comes up quite a few times. In verse 16, he says, I saw a flaming fire, and beyond these mountains a region, the end of the great earth. There the heavens were completed. It's like he's picturing that the sky is a dome that comes down and ends on at the end of the earth. And so he went out to that place. And so he describes this place where the sky meets the ground, and beyond that, there's stars that did not come out when they were commanded, and they were imprisoned and punished for 10,000 years. That same place became the prison for the angels as well, and it became a place for the souls of the dead. So there's 3 hollow places there. And again, he's describing this as a physical place where Enoch went to. But there's one hollow place for the righteous, there's one for the sinners who were punished in life, and one for the sinners who did not receive punishment in their lives, and they would be left there forever and not raised in the final judgment. So it was better to be executed for your sin, I suppose, and then not to be punished in this life. So, but that does not fit with the biblical teaching at all. All will be raised according to Jesus. And so there is no group of people that will not be raised in the final judgment. In book 2 of 1 Enoch, I don't know how to reference it, but it's book 2, chapter 1, verse 53. It says, also another phenomenon I saw in regard to the lightnings, how some of the stars arise and become lightnings and cannot part with their new form. And so this idea that some of the stars become lightning, just that's not true in any sense. But there's a lot of this type of idea of lightning and stars and that sort of thing in this book. The author was very fascinated by those things, but he didn't really understand them. And then after the flood, God said in 1 Enoch book 2, chapter 2, verse 64, "And after that, the head of days repented and said, 'In vain I have destroyed all who dwell on the earth.'" Now, there are some times where the scriptures talk about God repenting in a certain way, but here he says, after he's destroyed everyone, he says, "In vain. It was for nothing that I have destroyed all those who dwell on the earth." And I don't believe we can get that idea from the book of Genesis or anywhere else, that God felt like it was wrong for him to do it or worthless for him to do it. He did say he would never do it again, but this idea of "in vain I have done it" does not seem to fit at all. God knew what was going to happen and what the outcome would be. It's not as though he made a mistake. And that's what it sounds like he's saying, at least in this book. In book 3, in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, he talks about Methuselah taking a wife for his son Lamech, and then Lamech's wife having a son, which would be Noah. And so it talks about how he was white, very, very white. He even had white hair. And when he opened his eyes, he lighted up the whole house like the sun, and the whole house was very bright. So not just in a metaphoric way, but like literally there was light coming out of his eyes. And in verse 3, "Thereupon he arose in the hands of the midwife, opened his mouth and conversed with the Lord of righteousness." So right when he was born, he was talking to God. And his father Lamech was afraid of him and fled and came to his father Methuselah. Well, yeah, anybody would be afraid if that happened, but you don't get any idea like that from the book of Genesis, that the birth of Noah was anything special like this. But then we see that Methuselah is sent by his son Lamech to go talk to Enoch. Lamech tells him, "And it seems to me that he is not sprung from me, but from the angels. And I fear that in his days a wonder might be wrought on the earth. And now, my father, I am here to petition thee and implore thee that thou mayest go to Enoch, our father, and learn from him the truth, for his dwelling place is amongst the angels." That doesn't mean he's going to heaven, though. In verse 7, "And when Methuselah heard the words of his son, he came to me," that's Enoch talking, "to the ends of the earth, for he had heard that I was there, and he cried aloud, and I heard his voice, and I came to him." So he's living at the ends of the earth. This is the idea of basically a flat earth. This person did not know that the earth was round, whoever wrote this book. And again, we see Noah going to the ends of the earth and crying out to his grandfather Enoch as well later on. We have a list of different angels that did different sins. And one of them, Gadriel, is the one that led Eve astray. So there's no idea that Satan is one person. It's just different angels all doing these different things. We have the idea that the stars are thinking creatures who can disobey God. And that's why people started worshiping the stars, because they did not keep their prescribed orbits. And so what is really clearly wrong? Well, we saw a lot of it already, but it also tells us that in the year 500 in the 7th month, on the 14th day of the month in the life of Enoch. But Genesis 5 tells us he only lived 365 years. He did not live to a year 500. He was taken away before that. And Noah would have been born when Enoch would have been 434 years old, but he had already been taken by that time. So Noah could not have gone to talk to Enoch. He wasn't still on earth at that time. He was with God, not with the angels, but with God. And Methuselah also died the year of the flood. About 100 years before, God had said that Noah was the only righteous man on earth, but the Book of Enoch represents Methuselah as a righteous man, so that does not agree with the scriptures. And what about Jude? Now, Jude does seem to quote from the Book of Enoch when he says in Jude 1, verse 14 and 15, "Now Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men also, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. That is very, very, very similar to what is in Enoch chapter 1, verse 9. It is essentially a quotation, it seems, of what is written there. So how can we think about that? If we know that Enoch, the book of Enoch, is not inspired, what about Jude quoting him? So it could be a quotation of the book and just be quoting it as Paul quoted uninspired sources, like in Acts 17, when Paul says, "As some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring, therefore since we are the offspring of God," and so on. So we know that you can quote uninspired sources to make your point, even if you're inspired by God, but it also could be a real quotation from Enoch. And this is actually what I think is most likely, that Enoch really made that prophecy, and somehow the author of the book knew about that prophecy just like Jude did. Now, I don't know for sure how they knew about that prophecy from Enoch, but there were things passed down orally that were not written down. And it could be something like that the author of the book used. But just because he has a quotation from Enoch that is actually inspired doesn't mean that the whole book is inspired. So, it is a difficult issue to nail down. I don't know how to nail it down, what the actual connection there is, but what we know is Jude is inspired. He was accepted by the early Christians as inspired by God, the ones who knew, and the one who wrote the Book of Enoch never was accepted as inspired. 2 Peter is very similar. He talks about many of the same things that Jude talks about. They both talk about the angels not keeping their proper domain, and God delivering them into chains of darkness reserved for judgment. And in 2 Peter, it even then talks about Noah, right, at that time. And so some people think that's tied into the book of Enoch. But what they don't do is go into anything that contradicts the word of God. What they don't do is go into all these details that are just made up. They're talking about things that are true, things that happened, and they're making a point out of it, not just trying to bring up some interesting point or some interesting information to get people to read your book. So there's enough connection between the inspired books and the Book of Enoch to give people reason to question if it's also inspired, but there's also enough evidence within the book to show it's definitely not inspired by God. Because it's wrong and it contradicts things that are inspired by God. And God in his providence did not see fit to preserve it along with the inspired books. It was lost for over 1,000 years to most people. And while the Book of Enoch might contain an inspired prophecy, it seems to, the book itself is clearly not inspired and it does not belong in the Bible. So hopefully that will help those who've heard anything about the Book of Enoch or will hear about it to have an idea of how to look at it. All right. Thank you.